Okay, we'll get further into biology here. Biological productivity, starting from photosynthesis by the algae that have the chloroplasts needed for capturing the solar photons, energy from the solar radiation, and using CO2 and water to produce carbohydrates. And energy transfer is essentially sun's energy being converted into biological productivity by photosynthesizers, and that going into the various lengths of the food chain or the food web, concepts which you have been introduced to in some basic biology course in high school. So we'll look at the definition of primary productivity and briefly how it is actually measured, and how the productivity varies across the globe and how it changes seasonally. So you have to combine your concepts of wind changes, Hadley cell moving, trade winds, upwelling, nutrient supply, and how that changes seasonally. The feeding relationships, which is the food web and the food chain, and the fishing pressure from the humans. So humans are doing fossil fuel burning, increasing greenhouse gases, changing atmospheric circulation, amount of energy being trapped, which is going to obviously affect the ocean. So we'll look at more of that in the next chapter, but here we'll look at some aspects of how the global warming is affecting the ocean in terms of marine heat waves, for example, but also how humans are fishing the productivity of the ocean and how that changes the biodiversity, food chains, etc. in the ocean. To jump right into it, primary productivity is the rate at which energy is stored in organic matter. So you're taking CO2 and H2O and producing carbohydrate molecules, and there is an efficiency of light harvesting, which means efficiency of transfer of solar energy into biological productivity, which is photosynthesis. There is also chemosynthesis that we talked briefly about. For example, at the hydrothermal vents, there is no light, there is just noxious chemicals being produced. We talked about the Yeti crab, which is ingesting poisonous material but using the bacteria on its fur to digest that poisonous food, right? So there are chemosynthetic bacteria which break down the bonds and use the energy from the chemical bonds, like fermentation. And we will see that 99.9% of the ocean biomass, which means all the zooplankton, small fish, big fish, all the way to dolphins, whales, and so on, they directly or indirectly depend on photosynthesis for food, which means primary production serves at the bottom of the food chain. We'll briefly look at the difference between the productivity on land and in the ocean. Okay, there are some nice subtle differences that are important. So photosynthesis, obviously water plus carbon dioxide with sun's energy, is producing sugar and oxygen. And respiration is when whoever is photosynthesizing uses the energy produced to grow, to reproduce, to move, etc. That's respiration. Whereas heterotrophs like us, we ingest energy either through vegetarian food or meat or fish and so on, and we breathe in oxygen and respire CO2. So respiration, photosynthesizers also have to live, so they respire. So they use water and they use sugar and oxygen to convert back to carbon dioxide and water. So this is the chemical equation. 6H2O plus 6CO2 gives you C6H12O6, which is a basic molecule of carbohydrate, plus 6CO2. Okay, so when we say photosynthesis produces oxygen for us, we have to remember that photosynthetic life forms also respire, so they use back some of the oxygen they produce. The carbohydrate molecule that is not respired or gets sequestered, we talked about wetlands sinking in the ocean and so on, those carbohydrate molecules that are not respired release one molecule of CO2, or however many molecules, depending on how much of the carbohydrate got buried in peatlands or oil reserves, and so on and so forth. Right? Chemosynthesis, on the other hand, is using material like H2S, hydrogen sulfide, combining with H2O, CO2, and oxygen. So it's a process which uses oxygen as well and produces, again, carbohydrate, because that's why species are doing chemosynthesis, and they produce products like sulfuric acid, H2SO4. Okay, we won't do much on chemosynthesis. We'll mostly focus on photosynthesis. So this is the brief introduction. It's a long chapter, but has some amazing new information to learn about. So we will go slowly and have many podcasts in this chapter. Like the ocean circulation chapter, which had a lot of podcasts, we will go through the concepts step by step and have some fun.